1 Chronicles. We're going to do this pretty lightly because, again, I just told you what's really essential. And this is, the reading is just, oh, okay, see, here's what I told you, here it is. All right. So, Chronicles begins with a genealogical prologue, eliminating all narrative, even mention of the Exodus. There's no mention of the Exodus or Sinai events. The impression is given that all of that was rather preliminary and maybe somewhat less important in comparison to the work of David that follows. Obviously, the author of Chronicles knows that there are other sources out there. He's not the only document. This is not the only document you're going to read. So he doesn't worry about all of that. So he covers the distance from Adam to David with a very long genealogy that takes us to chapter 10, which is why your reading began with chapter 10. Okay? Verse 1. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. So that's going to be just previous to this. The genealogy led up to the king of Saul as king. But it's all from verse 35 of the previous chapter to this. That's the only coverage for King Saul. Again, monarchy isn't important. David and his followers are what's important. Verse 4 lists Saul's death. His armor bearer would not slay him, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. Verse 6, thus Saul died, he and his 3 sons, and all his house died together. Now that's not how Kings tells it. Saul has children who survive. And that's what means David cannot become immediately king of a united Israel. Remember, he has to deal with the other children. There are 2, Ishbosheth and I can't think, it's with an M, Mehishbosheth or something. So not all Saul's family dies at Gilboa, but in Chronicles it's just neater and tidier if he says they're all gone. Okay? Verse 13. Now, Saul couldn't have died without there being a little homily. Verse 13. So Saul died. Why? For his unfaithfulness. He was unfaithful to the Lord in that he did not keep the commandments of the Lord and also consulted a medium seeking guidance, did not seek guidance from the Lord. Therefore the Lord slew him and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. So, again, now Saul had other issues, remember? In the books of Samuel, he doesn't slaughter all and destroy all the things that were seized in battle. He doesn't kill the king of, what's his name? It will come to me after the class is over. He doesn't do God's will earlier. But notice Chronicles picks on the last time that Saul didn't obey God, when he, on the eve of the battle at Gilboa, he went to a fortune teller. Remember, and the fortune teller conjured up, Samuel. So again, it's necessary for the author that God's punishment come on the tail of the person's sin. I mean, if I sin when I'm 12, but don't get the punishment until I'm 80, what kind of lesson is that going to be? It's really important that the comeuppance come right on the tail of the bad action, which is what would happen if you were all God. But there'd be no world, because we'd be long destroyed if you were God. We'd be all gone long before you. Chapter, I don't make it up, I just tell you what it is. Chapter 12. Now, in Samuel, this takes place 7 years later, but there's no mention. All Israel gathered together to David at Hebron. So all Israel, notice, there's that emphasis. In Samuel, his own tribe anointed him at Hebron. But the northern kingdom didn't anoint him for 7 years. Chapter 11. Did I say, oh my Lord and my God, God's going to strike me. See, if you were God, I'd be dead. Long before year 3, I'd have been dead. Chapter 11, verse 3. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. Verse 4. And David and all Israel went to Jerusalem, that is Jebush, or Jebush. Verse 7. And David dwelt in the stronghold there. It was called the city of David. So again, if you follow the cross references, you'll see how the author is leaping over whole chapters that were in the books of Samuel. Turn to chapter 12, verse 38. There's an accounting of the army of David, not by tribe exactly, because there's more than 12 of them. There's like 16 groups. There's Zebulun and Issachar and Naphtali, but there's also Ephraimites and Manasseh. Now, Ephraim and Manasseh were the 2 children of Joseph, so they were all part of that tribe. There's a separation between Levites and the house of Aaron and Zadok. Those are all Levitical families. So there's a multiplication of divisions. So you don't have just 12 tribes and their armies. You have 16 different entities and the forces that they raise. Chapter 13. David consulted, previous verse. It ends, for there was joy in Israel. That's something I didn't mention in the earlier lecture, but the idea of everything is running like a good machine and there is joy in Israel. Chapter 13. David consulted with the commanders of thousands and of hundreds, with every leader. And David said to all the assembly of Israel, if it seems good to you, and if it is the will of the Lord our God, let us ascend abroad to our brethren who remain in all the land of Israel. Verse 3. Then let us bring again the ark of our God to us, for we neglected it in the days of Saul. And all the assembly agreed. So what's unique here is David polls the people. Should we bring the ark to the city, the new capital? And they all vote 99% in favor. In King or in Saul and Samuel, it's just David just does it on his own. And the movement to the ark is relatively effortless, where in Samuel, remember, somebody touched it and they got knocked dead, and so there's all of that. But again, that's, it's kind of cleared out here. So verse 13 of chapter 13. So David did. There is that episode, but chapter 14. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees, also masons and carpenters, to build a house for him. So David builds a palace for himself. Okay, chapter 15. David built houses for himself in the city of David, and then prepared a place for the ark of God, and pitched a tent for it. Then David said, no one but the Levites may carry the ark of God, for the Lord chose them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister to him forever. This is how the text avoids the multiple damages that take place when unholy people touch holy things. The Levites, the priests, and the Levites, who are the non-priestly families in the tribe of Levi, they're kind of the flunkies in the temple. They draw the water, and they cut wood, and someone has to take out the animal entrails. That's the Levites' job. And they are also going to carry the ark. Okay? So, again, you see this emphasis in this chapter on the importance of the temple and of those who take care of the temple. So there's a list of the Levitical families that follow. Verse 16. David also commanded the chiefs of the Levites to appoint their brothers as singers, who should play loudly on musical instruments, on harps and lyres and cymbals, to raise sounds of joy. So the Levites appointed Haman, son of Joel, and of his brethren Asaph, the son of Berechiah. And we'll stop right there. That's another long list of the names of the families of the singers and the musicians. Notice Asaph. When we read next time, we're going to read Psalms. You'll see that there are Psalms that are associated with the sons of Asaph. So these choral groups, you know, like everything else, it was heretical. Not heretical, hereditary. There's the word. Hereditary. If you're a bad singer, it's heretical. But just like being a priest was what your father did. So same here, the Levites, they did what their family did. All right? Verse 22, the end of this list of the singers. Kenaniah, leader of the Levites in music, should direct the music, for he understood it. That's a good sign. But you get somebody directing who understands it. Chapter 16. And they brought in the ark of God and set it inside the tent which David had pitched for it. Verse 4. Moreover, he appointed certain of the Levites as ministers before the ark of the Lord to invoke, to thank, and to praise the Lord, the God of Israel. Here's Asaph again, was the chief. And then there's, again, verse 5 near the end. Obed-Edom and Jeiel, who were to play harps and lyres. Asaph was to sound the cymbals. Benaiah and Jahaziel, the priests, were to blow trumpets continually before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. So you get the idea that music was going on all the time. That's not the case, but just again, you see the emphasis on the importance of liturgy. What dropped out of Samuel? Remember when David leads the ark into Jerusalem, he dances in front of it, okay? And his wife, Michal, who is the daughter of Saul, kind of badmouths him. All gone. Because it would reflect badly on David. Okay? So all that is just cut away. Then there's a long prayer of thanksgiving that parallels Psalms 105 and 106 and 96. So it's likely the Psalms were written first, and the chronicler is picking from the Psalms to put together this hymn of praise. Verse 37 of chapter 16. So David left Asaph and his brethren there before the ark of the covenant of the Lord to minister continually before the ark as each day required. And also Obed-Edom and his 68 brothers, while Obed-Edom, the son of Jeduthun, and Hosa were to the gatekeepers. And he left Zadok the priest and his brethren the priests before the tabernacle of the Lord in the high place that was in Gibeon. So there's a kind of division of labor. There is still a shrine at Gibeon. Because remember, Solomon is going to have his dream there, and then God says, what do you want? Do you want power over your enemies? And this is where Solomon says, no, I want wisdom. That takes place at the shrine at Gibeon. So there's a reference to that there are members of the Levitical families there, which legitimizes that. Because remember, everything else is focused on Jerusalem. So again, he's cleaning up. The author is cleaning up Solomon by winking to us and saying, oh yes, and there was a shrine at Gibeon. So when Solomon goes there, he's not showing infidelity to the temple in Jerusalem. Chapter 17, David is gearing up to build a temple now. And this is the parallel to 2 Samuel 7, when David asks Nathan, shall I build a house for God? And Nathan says, go ahead. And then God says to Nathan, go back and tell him no. And then that's when he makes that very long commitment. One of your offspring will always sit on a throne, but you may not build the temple. Okay, remember that? David says, I'm going to build you a house. And God says, no, I'm going to build a house, a dynasty for you. Here is the chronicler's version of that. 17 verse 10, second half. Moreover, I declare to you that the Lord will build you a house. When your days are fulfilled to go to be with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from him who was before you. So it's very close in parallel to what we read in the book of Kings. But it's just a central thing. But again, here David, where all his efforts in getting the musicians all together and all this is in moving the ark, is getting ready for the temple, God says, stop in the name of love. Okay? Chapter 18. After this, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them. He took Gath and its villages. Verse 2, he defeated Moab, and the Moabites became servants to David. Verse 3, David defeated Hadadezer, king of Zobah. What the author is doing here is really in short order saying, oh yeah, and David defeated lots of enemies. But then he moves on. That's not important. So again, he's retained David as a warrior, but he just doesn't give him any space, any column inches. Chapter 20. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go forth to battle, Joab led out the army. And what should be if you were reading Samuel, what's going to come next? David stays in the temple, so he stays home. So here is the literary splice. Okay, so he starts out as 2 Samuel 11 begins. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go forth to battle, it should say, David stayed in the palace. But it doesn't. He focuses on Joab led out the army and ravaged the country of the Ammonites and came and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem, and Joab smote Rabbah and overthrew it. That's it. That's all we know. No Bathsheba. That's a pretty important literary cut, don't you think? Chapter 21. Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to number Israel. Now, the parallel to this is 2 Samuel 24. In 2 Samuel 24, it's David's idea to number the people. But Chronicles, the author is careful to tell us it's Satan. Now, notice how the figure of Satan is already changing from how we saw him in Zechariah. He was the Satan. He is the prosecuting attorney. He says, look at Josiah the priest in his dirty robes. Remember? That's in Zechariah. Here he is becoming the tempter. Okay? So this is a reference to Satan as tempter. But earlier references to Satan in Zechariah and Job show him not as tempter, but as prosecuting attorney. And so that suggests that Chronicles is a couple centuries later in its development of thinking. But so it's not David's fault that he asked, because his general says, David, do you really want to do that? And David says, yeah. And then that makes God angry. And so the chronicler handles it, or not handles it, but explains it by introducing the temptation by Satan. Okay?
Why is taking a census so bad? I guess I missed that, or I don't get it.
Well, why did ancient peoples take censuses? Why does our government take? Well, no, you'll say to represent. We have proper representation. The ancients, taxes, and military. If you were calling people up for military, that's why. And the point is, those things are reserved to God. If God says we're going to war, then there's a war. So that's why that was a problem. Okay? Look at the end of the chapter, verse 25. So again, we're going to skip over. God says, "Okay, David, I'm pissed at you. You want to lose battles for a year? Do you want to get a plague? You want a famine? You choose." And David chooses plague. And so the angel, God's angel, brings the plague to the people. And look at verse 25. Oops, that's not. Verse 18. The angel of the Lord commanded Gad to say to David. That's about the area, but the point is, no, it's verse 16. There it is. David lifted his eyes and saw the angel of the Lord standing between heaven and earth, and in his hand a drawn sword stretched out over Jerusalem. Then David and the elders, clothed in sackcloth, fell upon their faces. So God has been sending the angel to maraud through the land, killing people by plague. But when David sees the angel of death over his city, he pleads with God. And on the threshing ground of Ornan. And so God says, okay, stop. Even though the time of the plague had not run itself out, God hears David's plea and stops the plague. And in verse 25, so David paid Ornan 600 shekels of gold by weight for the site. And David built there an altar to the Lord and presented burnt offerings and peace offerings and called upon the Lord. And he answered him with fire from heaven upon the altar of burnt offering. So kind of like kind of like Elijah. Thank you. Gosh, you guys. Like Elijah called down fire, but David sets up an altar and God himself provides the fire. Okay? And David has bought the threshing ground that overlooks the city. Verse 28, at that time when David saw that the Lord had answered him at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, he made his sacrifices there. For the tabernacle of the Lord, which Moses had made in the wilderness, and the altar of burnt offering were at that time in the high place at Gibeon. Again, a reference to Gibeon. The ark is in Jerusalem, but the altar is in Gibeon. But what's going to happen is that when Solomon builds the temple, he builds it on this piece of property. And I think it's a very powerful witness. Again, what's the temple about? Here is where we meet God in his mercy. Regardless how badly we've messed up, God promised to meet us here. And that's true of our worship. You know, if you say, what's the importance of a religious building? Because God has promised to meet us here. Not that God isn't someplace else, but God, regardless how badly we've done things, God will meet us here. And the idea that this was the spot where the angel of death was stopped, where God's mercy overcame his sense of justice, feeds into that. Okay? In chapter 22, David is told that he cannot build the ark because he's been a man of blood. Let's read a little bit of that. Verse 5, the last part, says, David provided materials in great quantity before his death. So his death is hinted at, and he gives 3 speeches, does David. And the first one begins with verse 6. He called for Solomon his son and charged him to build a house for the Lord. Verse 8. For the word of the Lord came to me, David says, saying, you have shed much blood and have waged great wars. You shall not build a house to my name, because you have shed so much blood before me upon the earth. Notice, though, again, the author of Chronicles has avoided all the combat scenes. Okay? But still, that memory of David as a man of warfare is remembered. Behold, a son shall be born to you. He shall be a man of peace. Okay? Verse 10, he shall build a house for my name. He shall be my son, and I will be his father. Verse 11, now, my son, the Lord be with you, so that you may succeed in building the house of the Lord your God, as he has spoken concerning you. Verse 14, with great pains I have provided for the house of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, and bronze and iron beyond weighing. Now, this is probably exaggerated, huh? A talent is 60 pounds. a talent weighs 60 pounds. So do the math, okay? And he tells him in verse 14, to these you must add. It's not enough. That's how wonderful the temple is going to be. You must add more. So that's the first speech. Then there is, again, a listing of the Levites that goes on for chapters. Oh my God, how boring. 28. 28 is David's second speech. Verse 2. King David rose to his feet and said, hear me, my brethren and my people. So the first speech was directed to Solomon. This is to all the people. Hear me, I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Verse 3. But God said to me, you may not build a house for my name. Verse 4. Yet the Lord God of Israel chose me from all my father's house to be king over Israel forever. Verse 5. And of all my sons, he has chosen Solomon, my son, to sit upon the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. This verse takes the place of the multiple chapters at the end of Samuel and the first chapters of Kings, where the sons of David fight over who's going to be the next king. David just announces it. God chose him. That never happened in Kings. Remember, they're kind of intriguing. Abijah gets crowned down. First Absalom is killed earlier when he makes himself king, and then Abijah crowns himself down at the well in Jerusalem, and then Bathsheba and Solomon come to David and say, I thought you were going to make my son king. Anyway, all that's written out because God has chosen Solomon. Verse 8. Now therefore, in the sight of all Israel, there's again, the assembly of the Lord, and in the hearing of our God, observe and seek out all the commandments of the Lord your God, that you may possess this good land and leave it for an inheritance to your children after you forever. And you, Solomon, my son, know the God of your father, and serve him with a whole heart and with a willing mind, for the Lord searches all hearts and understands every plan and thought. And if you seek him, he will be found by you. If you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. Footnote, that's the clearest statement of our friend, the law of retribution. In a statement. We see it in action, in narrative, but here is the principle. Okay? If you seek God, you will be found by him. If you forsake him, he will forsake you. Okay? Verse 11. Then David gave Solomon his son the plan of the vestibule of the temple. David had gone so far as to have it drawn up. He had an architect. He had drawn it up. He had gotten permission from the diocese. All was good. And that's how far along he had before God said, halt, your son will build it, you will not. Chapter 29 is the third speech of David. David the king said to all the assembly, Solomon, my son, whom alone God has chosen, is young and inexperienced, and the work is great, for the palace will not be for man, but for the Lord God. So I have provided for the house of my God as far as I was able. And another list of all the materials that he had collected. Verse 5, the last part. Who then will... So after enumerating all the wealth that David had piled up for this building, he challenges the assembly. Who will then offer willingly, consecrating himself today to the Lord? And thus was the Diocesan Annual Appeal founded. The real point is, the temple is not just David's work, it's the nation's work. Because even though David has acquired all of this, which is surely more than enough, now there's a great collection through the people. Okay, that's the following verses. Verse 6, then the heads of the fathers' houses made their freewill offerings, as did also the leaders of the tribes, the commanders of thousands and of hundreds. Verse 9, then the people rejoiced because these had given willingly. Verse 10, therefore David blessed the Lord in the presence of all the assembly. Blessed, this is that hymn of praise that's in the Liturgy of the Hours, the very first week, morning prayer, I don't know which day. Blessed are you, Lord, God of Israel, our Father, forever and ever. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. For all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, Lord, and you are exalted as head above all. Riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all. In your hand are power and might, and in your hand it is to make great and to give strength to all. And now we thank you, Lord, and praise your glorious name. Who am I? What is my people, that we should be able thus to offer willingly? For all things come from you, and of your own have we given. For we are strangers before you, and sojourners, as all our fathers were. Our days on the earth are like a shadow, and there is no abiding. Verse 22. So that's a big long prayer. And then it says, and they ate and they drank before the Lord on that day with great gladness. Again, joy, gladness, an underlying theme. And they made Solomon the son of David king the second time. And they anointed him as prince for the Lord, and Zadok as priest. Then Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord as king instead of David his father, and he prospered, and all Israel obeyed him. All the leaders and the mighty men, also all the sons of King David, pledged their allegiance to King Solomon, and the Lord gave Solomon great repute in the sight of all Israel. Again, remember, in Kings, Solomon has to kind of obliterate all his brothers who would be king, but not as the author tells it. See, Solomon is seated as king before David dies in Chronicles. So that's how neat and tidy the succession is. All right? Thus endeth the first book of Chronicles. Okay, comments, questions? Yes?
I know that this is supposed to be inspiring to the people after the exile, but no wonder some of the people said, this house is kind of
Nothing, like a garage. Yep.
Why did they blow it up so much? It was so magnificent and all of this. Wouldn't that make the people feel kind of bad? Or was it supposed to inspire them to give more? And
Teresa, this is a clergyman talking. Silly girl. You can never contribute too much to the house of God. There will be a collection, by the way, after the segment. Other questions or comments? Uni, this is your third one today. I'm keeping count.
Shall I just be quiet?
Maybe. Ask me during break. Other questions?
Just one comment. Did the people at the time not have copies of their own? They don't have access to copies of King's Right. It's just spoken to them. So if they don't know it, they're going to...
More importantly, not only did they not have copies, mainly they're illiterate.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. But they're not taught it. This is what they're going to be taught.
That mean, are you asking, would they see the differences?
Well, yeah. I mean, would there be any education?
I think the educated ones would, like you. The creme de la creme, the top percent, they would, again, but only, would the average Israelite have any materials to read from? Highly doubt it.
Not to read from, but I mean, maybe they would have heard it if they were in exile. Maybe nothing new. Maybe they're just getting back into
Again,
it.
yeah, and Kings wouldn't have been composed until the exile. Now again, go back and read the conclusion of exile. The reason of Kings, the reason that Kings is written is to explain how did we end in exile? Because all of our nasty kings, that's how. Okay, so it's got a theological point to it as well. But so you're asking, they would know the story more from preaching than from reading.
And from living it.
Yes, having been through it. Okay? Can I ask you to turn right to small group? Small group. So turn around. Find a group.
leave the room up.
Okay, order the room.